Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
My name is Terry Fleming, and I'm joining you today with gratitude and humility from the traditional and unceded territories of Lekwungen-speaking peoples, also known as the WSÁNEĆ, Songhees, and Esquimalt First Nations. And it's my great pleasure today to kick off Research Ethics BC's and with our partners, REB West 2022. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sequoia, who is joining us by phone. You may see me holding up my phone, and that really is just Sequoia is here with audio. And she's a knowledge keeper and elder who's going to help kick us off in the right way for this meeting this morning. Thank you, everyone. Sequoia, over to you.
Hi, Austin. I welcome each and every one of you to the ancestral traditional territory of Squamish Nation, where you're being audioed into on my cell phone, and I acknowledge, respect, and honor the ancestral traditional First Nation lands where you live, work, and play. And I welcome you today to this awesome event. And my apologies for the technical difficulties. I don't know what Zoom is doing to me today, and I can't zoom in on you. So I'm doing it by audio, and I just want you to all come together with Nshoma and Shkwa and one heart and one mind today to be able to chen, swipe, stand, and work together to hold each other up and support one another. And that's what we're doing now with Terry and all of you. You're all holding me up by letting me join you in this way. And my late grandfather always talked to me about our inner energy that we all have and that we receive from Creator through the top of our head into our inner energy, and we can send to each other and receive from each other, and can't have our arms crossed or hands clasped. So I'd like to have all of you open your hands on your desktop, on your lap, on the armchairs, chair arms, or something, and just take a few breaths in and a few breaths out. And we're going to let our energy flow to each other and help each other for today. I'm going to sing Reading of the Day. It's Sequoia's song, and it's a healing song to help you get grounded and be focused for your gathering today. Then I'll do a short prayer, and then I'll turn you back over to your moderator. Asking you, Creator, to watch over all your children gathered today and all their family, friends, and communities where they're from and where they live, work, and play, and put a shield of safety and protection around all of them. And and help them with their swollen feelings in their hearts and minds and their emotional, mental, physical, and spiritual wellness and health. Asking the Creator to watch over all our family in terms of serious illnesses, injuries, those with anxiety, depression, COVID, long COVID, and all the other many illnesses and treatments that there are. Here are prayers for their health, healing, and recovery. Asking the Creator to let today's work be it one hard job and excellent work today, and asking the Creator to let the words that are shared and listened to be respectfully done, and help all the presenters in their swollen and their work to present and transfer knowledge and information, and that Creator let them all come together with enjoyment with swollen, one heart and one mind to Chen twice, and take care of all of them. Come out, Nation. Those are my words. And Chen Quinman told me for letting me join you in this action.
Thank you so much, Sequoia.
Okay, then I'll turn it back over to all of you, and I'm going to leave now.
Okay, thank you very much, Sequoia. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Okay, see you.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you very much to Sequoia for adapting so that we could still have a really nice welcome from her this morning. And now, just before I turn over to the moderator, I'd just like to remind everyone that this session is being recorded for sharing afterwards. And it is at this point that I'd like to introduce Asma-na-hi Antoine, and I encourage you to read her biography. We will put a link to the biographies of all of our speakers. I think Jessica and or Rachel will look after that in just a moment in the chat. And oh, there it is. She's very efficient. Thank you very much, Jessica. And now I'll turn it over to Asma-na-hi. Thank you, everyone.
Clecco, Terry, Clecco, Sequoia for the opening prayer. My heart, that one heart, one mind, and that interconnected between heart and mind, and just that I feel grounded. That planting feet, open hands, bringing in the energy that is needed. Thinking about the cyberspace, the traditional cyberspace between where I'm at and where everyone who is joining us today. Hold my hands up to the Lekwungen, Songhees Nation, and Kosaps and Esquimalt Nations traditional lands. I'm grateful to the ancestors and to their families who support the work that I do here, where I live, where I work, where I learn. Grateful to the relatives from Wasanich, Chianu, Beecher Bay, Sauk, Sioux Nation, and Malahat Nation that surround where I am sitting today at the southern tip of Vancouver Island. I'm also grateful to the relatives that got the east coast of Vancouver Island up to Kwakwakwa lands, and also grateful on the west coast of Vancouver Island is where my relatives come from. My name, Asma-na-hi, means caring for precious ones, and it comes from my late mother, Vera Thompson's family from Tokwat Nation of Newtowneth lands, also ties into Clayoquot Nation. My last name, Antoine, comes from my late father, Eugene Antoine, from Iccos Nation, from Carrier Sakani lands, and ties into Dididat Nation through my father's family as well. And I'm just grateful to my ancestors, my own ancestors, and the family and my own families back home, which over this pandemic and this energy of gathering, missing those gatherings over the last 4 days, I work at Railroads University as the Director of Indigenous Engagement and the lead in Indigenous Research Ethics. So I'm grateful to sit in circle with each and every one of you today. And one of the things that working on my PhD, my dissertation, and I'm grateful, and I'm a little bit nervous, I'm going to say this, I'm a little bit nervous sitting with Dr. Michelle Pidgeon, who is my academic supervisor, but my mentor, and I just hold my hands up to you. And so just moderating, and I was like, I feel very humble today. I want to talk a little bit about protocols that have been missing since the beginning of time. Captain Cook, which arrived in the Newtowneth lands, just arrived, and our family was saying "Nuka, Nuka," which meant go round. It didn't mean welcome; it meant go round. This isn't because you could see his ship coming, and the families were like, "Nope, wrong place, but of course he landed, and then all of a sudden contact and colonization had began. Today is each and every day I think about protocol and thinking about how do we engage with each other, how do we be in relations with each other. So I'm grateful for today, and I'm going to let the moderators. I'm the moderator. Let our panelists introduce themselves, and we're going to start with Tara, Sarah, and then I'm going to turn it over when Dr. Michelle Pidgeon. When you introduce yourself, I'm going to ask you to launch into your presentation.
Thank you, Asma-na-hi, and thank you, Sequoia, for the opening. My name is Tara Erb, and I am calling in today from White Cap Dakota First Nation in Saskatchewan. So I'm in a hotel room, traveling right now, attending another gathering in here, and very grateful to be here. It's very gorgeous. And normally I would be calling in from where I work, my office, the Lekwungen speaking territories, Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich, and very grateful to be a visitor there as well. I myself am a Moose Cree First Nation as well as French, so from out east, Treaty 9, Moose Factory, very southern tip of James Bay is where my community is from. And I am the network coordinator for the BC NEIHR. So that stands for Network Environment for Indigenous Health Research. I'm also a student just starting my PhD, and very happy to be here and chat with you folks today. Thank you, and I'll pass it on to Sarah.
Thank you, Tara, and thank you, Asma-na-hi, as well, and Sequoia for the really grounding, beautiful opening. I think it's really needed for me right now. And also, hi, everyone. It's really amazing to, be here. I feel very honored and grateful. I'm going to be talking a bit about the work that I've been doing with the BC NEIHR, and my name is Sarah Littlechild, and I'm Nahai for my father and Ukrainian for my mother. I'm speaking to you right now from the unceded ancestral lands of the Lekwungen and Wasanich peoples. So this includes the Songhees, Esquimalt, as well as Pakwachin, Tsartlip, Sayout, and Saikum nations. And though I've been living here since around 2005, I'm originally from Treaty 6 territory, and my community is the Ermineskin Cree Nation in Musqueam, Alberta, and I feel I'm actually going back home in July to do some gathering of medicine. So I'm feeling very excited and keep thinking about that a lot in my connection to family. And I'm currently a graduate student in the Master of Social Work Indigenous Specialization program at UVic. And I'm in the beginning stages of doing my thesis journey that really revolves around culturally centered decolonial harm reduction approaches. And at the same time, I've been working with the BC NEIHR on a contract basis since January to conduct an environmental scan of all of the research ethics boards in BC to really capture the ethical review processes surrounding Indigenous focused research. So that's just a little bit of the work that I'll be talking about when it's my time. And thank you so much. That's it.
Well, I am first thankful to the organizers and the planners, and thank you to Elder Sequoia. She worked closely with us here at SFU, and so she's like our auntie extraordinaire. So it's always good to hear her words and her energy and her voice. So, and also thank you to Asma-na-hi for being the moderator. And I'm humbled and honored to sit with three amazing next generation of scholars. So please, the honor is mine to sit with you all in circle. I'm Michelle Pidgeon. I'm of Mi'kmaq ancestry, originally from Newfoundland, but I've been living and working on the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish since about 2002. I think I moved myself out here. And today I'm currently coming to you from the unceded territories of the Kwantlen, Katzie, Tsawwassen, and Sami-Yahu First Nations, as I'm coming to you from Surrey, BC. And I work at SFU in the Surrey campus. At SFU, I hold the role of Associate Dean Indigeneity, and also an associate professor there in the mostly within the educational leadership program. So that's a little bit about me, and I guess I'll begin our conversation. And I think part of what I thought of in thinking about sharing with you today is, let me get my slides going. The testing, here we are. So one of the things I want to share with you today is really just speaking to some opening comments that help frame really, I think, the work that Sarah and Tara have been doing locally within the province, and thinking about what are these concepts that we're even talking about? What is Indigenous research ethics? And thinking about how do we understand that as REBs when we're looking at applications? So is it the components of the methodology? Is it the who are the participants?
Sorry to interrupt, Michelle. So the screen that I see is not in presentation mode. It is in, I see the notes there. That's
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Always happens, so appreciate it. Okay, so let's think about what is Indigenous research. Is it about the methodology and process? Is it about who the research is being conducted with? And thinking about the ways that the work is being done. And I think those pieces are all important in consideration, because in my understanding of Indigenous research processes, it is all of those things. And it can be all of those things, or just some of those things, depending on the who, the what, the when, the where, and the why. And thinking about Indigenous research as expanding beyond the animate and inanimate. So it includes the holistic view of the ways that we do our research that connects to the lands, the waters, the animals, the creatures, the trees, all of it is part of Indigenous research. And so when we think about REBs, we see the siloing that happens of human research, animal research, and then other parts. And so thinking about those pieces, I think, are important for us in thinking about the ways that we're talking about what is Indigenous research. And then who does Indigenous research? Well, again, I think the who depends on how they locate themselves, their connections to community, whether they're Indigenous or non-Indigenous. There are folks who do Indigenous research work with communities. Whether they situated under a research methodology is different than the actual Indigenous research process. And so thinking about the who matters. I think about, for example, Indigenous graduate students who are going back into their own communities to do work and do their research within their community. They are both insiders and outsiders in that work. But yet their Indigenous cultural frames of ethics override, in some ways, the requirements of an REB, because there are cultural connections and responsibilities that go before, during, and after the research, which goes beyond the scope of a traditional REB. And so I just pose these kind of reflection questions for us to start thinking about what does it mean? And simply also say, just because we're Indigenous doesn't necessarily mean we're doing Indigenous research. So we can't assume that an Indigenous applicant is doing Indigenous research. And so how do we kind of think about that together and really think about that process of how we understand the ways that research is done and the ways that we might think through that together. And then how do we understand Indigenous ethics? I think the way that I think about it is it's holistic, it's interconnected, and it's relational. And it's informed by the cultural practices of the person doing the work and the communities that they're working with, right? So as someone from the East Coast, I have learned in my time here about the ways that Coast Salish protocol guides all the work that we do. And so being a guest, but also Indigenous, means I have this responsibility to understand those cultural differences along with the ways that we might do this work here versus how I might do it if I go home. So to me, Indigenous ethics is connected to culture, land, place, language. And there are some nuances within that that are not, I think about the work of Graham Smith and thinking about the private knowledge and public knowledge. There are things that we as Indigenous people can share publicly. And I would say REB research is public research. And there's things that we do privately. And those things might be ceremony. It might be the protocols that we honor during the research process that we would call ceremony. But yet the details of that can't be really nuanced in a schedule or a protocol, because it's ceremony and it's connected to culture and practice. So those pieces are important. And then thinking about then, what are the intersections, tensions, and allowances between this broader understanding of Indigenous ethics, research, and research ethics boards? And thinking about those pieces as we navigate that work together, thinking about the intersections that Indigenous research and Indigenous ethics goes well beyond the scope. It starts from the beginning of starting a relationship that leads to the question, that leads to the project, that leads to an application of a grant, to the places that we think about how we share that knowledge that we've learned. So within an academic role, you know, if it's through publications, my first priority always when I work with community is to give back to the community first. And that might be through presentation, it might be through sharing of resources, it might be through these, you know, reports and things like that. And that later on may become, you know, a peer-reviewed article. And I know Tara and Sarah are going to speak to the connections between tenure and promotion and this piece, but I'll just lay that there as a way of setting that up. And then thinking about some of the tensions are, how do we know who has the right to speak for community? And how do we understand those relationships within communities? And so I just participated in 2 days, and some of you may have also been there, within Athabasca U had a 2-day conference on Indigenous research and ethics. And Jessie King from UNBC was there, and she was speaking about the tensions of going into community and not necessarily having a sense of the process of chief and council having some role. Things were happening in the community, and I'm sorry, Jessie, if you're here and I'm misspeaking your story, I came in on the end of it, but thinking about the point I took away from your story was that it wasn't until you were in community did you figure out how those ethical relationships and those processes happen, and introductions were made, and then all of a sudden the research was happening, right? And thinking about Indigenous graduate students that I've worked with over the years, it's that same tension of going through an REB can be the place that actually stops our students from proceeding, because it is such a process where lack of understanding of what constitutes an Indigenous community, who has authority to speak for that community. Now, it's different when there's a band and council or an established community ethics board, but when we're thinking about, say, organizations or Indigenous employees who may be working within a particular type of organization, that there's no voice, one voice that can speak as authority. And so thinking about those tensions, I think, are important, especially when we think about the role of REBs in supporting Indigenous research, and I think particularly about Indigenous graduate students in this one, because they're on a time frame. And so they only have a certain amount of scope. So thinking about those pieces, but I think there's so many allowances too, to the ways that we can think about what we can learn from Indigenous ways of doing this work, but also think about the burden and responsibility that's getting asked of us and the limited resources we have to actually be doing this work alongside you. And that there are ways that work and burden becomes so much more on us because of our connections to community, because we know our elders are watching us, because we have this dual role of both being in the academy and being part of community. And those tensions are real. The burnout is real. And I think the evidence of COVID just kind of took the Band-Aid off things that were already a problem in our institutions. So as a higher ed scholar, I can speak for days on that, but I'll stop there on that. But certainly I just want to bring us back around to the circle, and thinking about, and the framework I share with you is the framework I use in my own work that really speaks to this idea of holism, about the interconnections of individual, family, place, relationships, and thinking about the holistic needs around the physical, intellectual, spiritual, emotional, and thinking about those 4 R's of the Verna Kirkness and Ray Barnhart as a way of thinking about Indigenous ways of doing this work, and Indigenous ways of guiding the work ahead. And so with that, I will stop and say, Filalin, thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for that oversight and overview of your knowledge. And I have some dire questions and dire comments in that, but I also want to recognize we have 121 participants, and participants, please feel free to add in the chat box where you're located any comments or questions. But I want to go back and reflect on how data is collected, and thinking about this as a question maybe we can answer later, but the data collection when it's private, Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing and being. As a researcher, when we're going into communities and we're working with families, or whether they're our own or others, and thinking about that data collection of that, and very in-depth conversations, setting those boundaries with researchers as they're going in. What kind of data collection are they gathering, and how are they distinguishing between the private and public Indigenous knowledges to put into their work? I'm going to pass it now, so we will come back to that. I want to open up the floor and invite Tara and Sarah into this space. Thank you, Dr. Michelle Pidgeon.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Asma-na-hi. I will just ask Rachel, sorry, to put my screen slides up for me. Perfect, thank you. And I'll just let you know when it's time to skip them. So as I said, I'm the network coordinator for the BC NEIHR. I'll just give 1 minute of an overview. The BC NEIHR is a 5-year grant that is funded by CIHR. We are a national initiative, so there are 9 of us across Canada, and we serve the province of BC. So most of our programming is about funding Indigenous trainees, so graduate students and postdocs, as well as early career researchers, Indigenous early career researchers, and what we always say is ICCOs, so Indigenous communities, collectives, and organizations. We have funding for them as well. This is the NEIHR is exciting because if we get renewed, it's the most the government has ever resourced Indigenous health research. It's over $100 million if we're renewed twice. So yeah, and lots of great work happening within the NEIHR. I encourage you to reach out to me if you have any questions or would like to learn more about the network or join the network yourself. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some work we're doing around Indigenous cultural safety and research. And I'm going to share with you a framework that Dr. Charlotte Lopi and our working group have been working on for over a year now. This will be made public. It's kind of in the final stages with the graphic designer, but I'll be sharing some pieces of it with you. And it's really important because one aspect of it is looking at Indigenous research ethics, but you can't really think about Indigenous research ethics unless you think of the environment. And so this is a very environmental approach, looking at light and water as our resources, our roots of ontology, epistemologies, and methodologies that feed and support the structures of research, like the funders, the REBs, institutions, and then the STEM environments of our outputs and impacts, and how it fits and works together, how it's all interconnected. So I'm going to just provide a bit of an overview of this framework, and then Sarah will speak about specifically work that we're doing with the REBs and Indigenous Research Ethics, and so will I'll speak after her as well about some of the specific work we're doing, but I really just encourage you to think about it with this environmental approach and not thinking of just the ethics, but how that fits in the environment of research. Rachel, next slide, please. So the concept of cultural safety has become a key component of Canada's commitment to reconciliation. there is generally an increased willingness among professionals to participate in, I'll start saying ICS, Indigenous Cultural Safety Training initiatives. And that's created the need for more ICS training and initiatives as a response to our national consciousness to address health barriers and inequities. Next slide, please. So a lot of the work we're doing is acknowledging that ICS is no less critical to the practice of research. Clearly, there's a need in post-secondary institutions, REBs, funders, and other research organizations, such as Health Research BC, to adopt ICS and anti-racism as a pillar of research ethics. So our framework, which will be available soon, intends to address anti-Indigenous racism on 2 levels. First, we're addressing the harm and discrimination and barriers Indigenous researchers continue to experience when pursuing research funding and ethics review processes, as well as engaging in the structural environment, such as institutional standards for research career pathways. Publish or perish is a good example there. Second, the framework will address potential harm perpetuated by non-Indigenous researchers who don't practice Indigenous cultural safety within their research and who propose to conduct research with ICCOs. Next slide, please. Sorry, let me go down on mine. So in defining Indigenous health research, CHR states that respectful relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples can only be established when the research environment is socially, spiritually, emotionally, and physically safe. So that's on their website. But we also learned from our Mi'kmaq elder, Albert Marshall, that while trees drop seeds on the ground each year, some will remain dormant for 3 or 4 cycles. So Elder Marshall says, in heeding these, seeds germinate when the environment is right. So in heeding Elder Marshall's teaching, the BC NEIHR is introducing a research environment framework, which employs a land and water-based metaphor to understand the interrelated parts of our research environment. So next slide, please. So this is a model we've created, and you can see we have a colonial research environment and a decolonial research environment. This is we tried to take something very complex and even on some levels abstract and bring it down into something visual that could be grasped. So there's limitations to the model, but yeah, let me explain a little bit about it. So within the colonial research environment on the left, I hope you guys can read everything. We have this metaphorical tree, which is research, and it's isolated and carefully manicured, and its products are rigidly controlled. Growth is not organic. It's in an individualistic environment, which limits what the soil can nourish and how the roots can grow. They don't support diversity and interconnectedness, hence the pots. Within this model, resources are restricted to the immediate environment. So the pots, the light and the water gets channeled and funneled and held within the pots. And it really only supports and produces what has been planted. The knowledge produced within this colonial research environment can be extractive rather than generative or useful outside of this limited context. And finally, these research environments can be uprooted or moved and just very controlled as well as replicated easily. And just some context there with like the roots. As I was saying, we have our ideologies and epistemologies within these roots. And then the structures, we're looking at the core structures as the funders and the REBs, as well as the institutions. And then the STEM environments, and they're in this environment is like career-based, the outputs and impacts. So then on the right side, our decolonized research environment, our metaphorical trees are established and they grow naturally without external restrictions or cultivation. So growth is more organic and unrestricted, and it's a communal environment. So it nourishes diversity and interconnectedness. The community knowledge produced by the decolonized research environments is transformative and supports the roots of community action. These environments also tend to be more sustainable as communities outside academia are meaningful, engaged in seeding, growth, and production processes. So next slide, please. Thank you. So we have to just talk a little bit more actually about the ethics part and the ethical processes before I go into the specific work we're doing within that model with Sarah and I. How we're understanding ethics and ethical processes within that model is that individuals who develop ethical guidelines and serve on REBs, right, are no less susceptible to colonial beliefs or misconceptions or assumptions than any other individual. So we kind of came into it with this acknowledgement that there is a lack of understanding about the importance and complexity of Indigenous ways of knowing and being. And you can see that how different the environments are, right, when it's side by side like that. So there can be conflicting worldviews and cultures at epistemology and ontology parts. So unfortunately, and this came out in a lot of the work Sarah and I were doing, is Indigenous researchers and communities and trainees continue to experience harm through culturally unsafe structures that are rooted in those epistemologies and ontologies. And just an example, non-Indigenous reviewers may lack, like in some comments people have made, may lack an understanding of the Indigenous research relationships and protocols. So that interconnectedness, the communal environment, how our accountability can go to our ancestors as well as children not yet here, be accountable to land, things like that. So our sense of accountability is broader and interconnected. And then we also acknowledge that there's our Tri-Council policy statement, chapter 9, but many of the structures and systems within this environment are still not fully implementing the policy, or at least questioning how, and like having the discussions, but not quite there. So we're our work is to support that. And yeah, I'll introduce Sarah now, who will look at, we did 2 things. Oh, well, we're doing many things within this model, but 2 of them include an environmental scan, which Sarah will speak about. So I'll pass the floor to her, and then I'll come back and just give a very quick summary of some of the sharing circles that I've conducted. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Tara, and Michelle, and Asma-na-hi as well. Sorry, just give me 1 second here. Yeah, so as I said, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the environmental scan of the BC REBs that I've been doing with the BC NEIHR. I'm not 100% complete doing this work, but I wanted to share a little bit about you know, some of the things that that were shared with me and spoken about within my connections with the REB administrators that I spoke with, as well as the ethics applications that I reviewed. So ultimately, though, I did want to say that as a student, you know, really just beginning to move through the REB process, I really wanted to make clear that I personally have a limited amount of work and lived experience when it comes to ethical review processes. You know, I've done collaborative health research within urban Indigenous communities before, using Indigenous methodologies, but I've never actually been a part of a research ethics board or done work surrounding this up until this current work. So, you know, really in this, I've only been doing content analysis. So therefore, I just, you know, I really wanted to be transparent in my limited firsthand knowledge of ethical reviews and state that my role in this environmental scan has really been only to gather and document the knowledge out there from the REB's perspectives, which I'll share some of here. Sorry, my cat's going crazy. Ultimately, the BC NEIHR and Research Ethics BC will kind of use this documentation that I've compiled to implement next steps for change, which will ultimately be shared with all the REBs once complete. So if you could just change the slide, Rachel, please. So I just, wanted to provide a bit of an introduction. So the purpose of completing this environmental scan is really to evaluate the REB application, review, and approval process, to look at things like strengths and or any gaps and level of involvement of Indigenous ICCOs at all stages of the review process. And the overall goal of this work is really to ensure that there's cultural safety and anti-racism, as Tara said, within the REB's ethical reviews to prevent Indigenous researchers from being harmed as they go through this process. Also, it's to ensure that there's protection for Indigenous communities and knowledges. It's also to support the strengthening of relationships between Indigenous communities and REBs, and also to ensure that the REBs have all the resources they need to really review the ethics applications that involve Indigenous focused research. So this work will kind of inform the BC NEIHR on how to best support ICCOs as well to be self-determining in the research that involves their people's lands and knowledges. So over a period of 4 months, I held one-on-one interviews via Zoom, phone, and email with REB administrators encompassing both academic institutions and health authorities. And out of 27 total REBs in the province, 20 were spoken with to share their processes. One REB responded via email, but we were, ultimately unable to finalize the time to answer questions. And 6 REBs didn't respond to my request to connect. But while in these meetings, I did speak with between 1 and 3 REB members, most often including the chair, sometimes including an Indigenous REB member. And so the questions that I posed to REBs are listed here. So what, if any, Indigenous focused learnings are REB members required to receive? Secondly, what, if any, involvement do ICCOs have in the REB? So things like, developing protocols, materials, reviewing applications. Also, how many, if any, Indigenous people are on the REB, and would they be allocated all of the Indigenous focused applications? And is ICCO ethical approval required? So if so, what process is undertaken to confirm it? And this question, I think, concerns not only confirming community consent, but also respecting community-specific ethical protocols and governance and laws. And then I also asked about any wise practices or strengths that REB members saw within their board processes, as well as any gaps that they could identify. So in addition to speaking directly with REB members, I also, like I said, looked at institutional application forms for ethical review. And I reviewed both the harmonized application forms that 22 out of the 27 REBs use for multi-jurisdictional research. And in total, I think I reviewed 29 ethics applications. And so far, I've been unable to locate 3 out of the 27. And through looking at these forms, I used these set of questions here, which were collaboratively developed by Dr. Charlotte Lopi and Tara Erb from the BC NEIHR. And I really used these as a guide to see if they were present in all forms for the ethical review. And so these questions were asking about existing relationships with ICCOs. So looking at those meaningful and genuine relationships that researchers, have before sort of the ethics application. Also questions relating to the level of involvement or leadership by ICCOs. So again, going beyond just, that kind of consent, but is meant to actually include leadership and guidance from the community. Also questions relating to OCAP or TCPS Chapter 9, And so I did look for evidence of this throughout the applications, but I was specifically looking for questions that directly reference them. So in a way, it kind of goes beyond just sort of data stewardship and control, and was more sort of looking at it within an Indigenous context specifically. And then the last one, which I feel is very important, was questions asking about protection of Indigenous knowledge that was shared through the research. So this question really speaks more to, I think, how researchers will plan to protect wisdom that's shared through the research so as to prevent it from kind of entering the institutional and public spheres. Because, you know, not all knowledge that's shared through research is meant to be shared widely. And so ultimately in doing all this work, speaking with the REBs and reviewing the applications, I did identify some key commonalities across them. So Rachel, just the next slide, please. So, and again, these are all from the REBs that I spoke to's perspectives, and really something that was very common across pretty much everyone I spoke with was kind of this lack of resources, and resources including time and energy and financial and institutional support to really make a lot of the changes needed to truly further support and provide genuine awareness around Indigenous focused research ethics. So for example, a lot of REBs I spoke to stated that they can't actually compel REB members to take Indigenous focused trainings because they're largely in volunteer positions. And they also don't want to overburden folks who are already often overworked and pulled in different directions. So it's really kind of encouraging members to take the training available. And in the same way, many REBs spoke to how power is not really with the board in a lot of ways. They kind of face an uphill battle to create that sort of systemic change. And this often comes from the institutional level, can sometimes be a challenge to get everyone on board with the structural and systemic changes that are needed. And according to a lot of REB members I spoke to, an actual cultural shift is needed, you know, to change the structure of their processes. And ultimately, not all, but many institutions have the resources available, you know, for REBs to sort of make those changes, but a lot of it's not being prioritized. And also, I just wanted to say one REB I spoke to also stated that they have a lot of pressure to kind of move things along, to not hold the research up for sort of quote unquote cultural issues. As well, a lot of people recognized an increased need for cultural safety and what needs to be asked of people, but a lot of folks are sometimes frightened to bring these issues up because they don't know what language to use, or you know, ensuring that the language that they do use is correct and isn't causing harm inadvertently. So there were also a lot of strengths and good practices within the REBs. And so these were kind of what were identified by those I spoke with, as well as ones that I identified. So a lot of our REBs do hold genuine relationships with ICCOs. You know, some institutions are working closely with local nations to support the redevelopment of their own research ethical review capacities, and partnering with local nations to you know, follow the nation's own ethical review practices, and to have their own institutions, have that built into the institutional REB. And despite some limited capacity, you know, many REBs do take the time to kind of truly connect with researchers proposing to do projects, to both, you know, provide support to research teams, as well as ensuring that there's cultural safety for all involved. So for example, some REBs require that researchers meet with them beforehand to kind of discuss the project as part of that ethical review process. And they want the ethical review process to kind of be like a teaching and a coaching tool. And nearly all the REBs that I spoke with are very they have a strong desire for the changes that are needed and building on their strengths, and they are very mindful not to overburden Indigenous members and ICCOs that they might work with. So, for example, doing things like allocating all of the Indigenous focus applications to one board member for review. And they also know that they need to build, stronger relationships with communities in many ways, but in a lot of ways, they also don't know how to start this process. A lot of folks didn't. So, many REBs know that there's a need for meaningful relationships in local communities, but to really ensure that there's cultural safety even within clinical trials, and that needs to be led by the wisdom of those communities. Some REBs spoke to the helpfulness of having Research Ethics BC, increase its educational offerings on cultural safety and humility for working with Indigenous communities. They stated, that obviously the more that REBs are able to work together, or everybody's able to work together, that, it's much better than the REBs trying to figure things out on their own. And then there were some identified gaps and barriers. Sorry. I run out of breath a lot. My apologies. So these were identified with, again, both the REB members I spoke to, as well as sort of what I identified. So one, there's not always enough guidance for researchers to ensure that they're doing ethical work with ICCOs. So in some cases, there can be a significant gap because the researcher the researcher might be misguided by supervisors, and sometimes, don't connect with community or don't really know how to do so. There's also not often a lot of guidance for researchers, before going through the application process on what constitutes, quote unquote, Indigenous engagement. So, for example, in my own work, like I was unclear for a long time as what actually constituted research that had to happen before or after the ethical review process. So like I kind of actually was unclear. I thought that advisory groups had to be cleared first, whereas that's not actually the case. It's actually part of kind of our relationship building. So having that, I think that a lot of REBs are increasingly, again, like I said, trying to meet with researchers and students to have that connection. But I think that there's also a need to make sure that REBs are more approachable and that they connect with those who want to do Indigenous focused research. And also ensure that supervisors and faculty understand that this is necessary. However, there's also often not enough guidance for the REBs either to ensure that they can review Indigenous focused applications in a good or less harmful way. So for example, one REB stated that the biggest gaps are not having guidance and information from their own institution, or even from Research Ethics BC. And a few REBs stated that they do have a limited understanding of Indigenous research ethics in general, including things like OCAP principles. Some REBs also stated that some researchers who might not self-identify as Indigenous on the ethics application, they want to do Indigenous focused research, could get asked additional questions pertaining to their research. And in this way, it was stated that the REB could cause inadvertent harm to them. And but the thing is that the REBs are not necessarily comfortable asking who is Indigenous and who isn't. And there can sometimes be a disconnect between what the REBs say their process for ethical review is and what questions are asked or not asked on the application form specifically. So I do understand that questions often, come up afterwards that are asking for extra information, but on the application forms initially, for example, a lot of the ethics applications that I did look at really had no questions specifically speaking to Indigenous research. And, ultimately, it's kind of like the applications do tend to be a little bit bare, even though I think the REBs themselves, talk about the research should include more information, but it's not initially asked. For example, really that protection of Indigenous knowledges, I think that question that I was kind of looking for, asking researchers or prompting them to explain how they'll protect knowledge that's shared through the research that doesn't necessarily belong within the institutional environment. And, I felt like the protection of knowledge is mostly kind of, again, placed in the context of, managing or keeping or destroying data and confidentiality. But I do believe that these questions have to go a little bit deeper to kind of push researchers and the REB to consider how they'll determine what knowledges should be shared and which ones should be, kept from that wider public setting. So for example, things like, what Michelle talked about in terms of, wisdom that's shared in ceremony or about ceremonial practices or ancestral stories. Some knowledges are not meant to be shared for outsiders or are meant to be shared widely or recorded. And I feel like it's important to have questions prompting researchers to think about this and how they'll have a plan in place to kind of know which ones, should stay within kind of like the hearts, minds, and spirits of community members. And, I think this would be important for researchers to consider because it has and it continues to be an issue within our communities. I think it's necessary because it acknowledges the need to sort of stop that appropriation of knowledge and culture for personal and or financial gain that doesn't actually benefit Indigenous communities. Also, it was spoken about a lot how all Indigenous centers, board members, liaisons, and communities are overworked, and REBs often, again, don't want to contribute to this overburden. And this is particularly true, I think, with institutions as they work to try to, indigenize their spaces. Indigenous peoples at all levels are pulled in different directions and are often really under supported in the work that they do. However, sometimes this could also potentially equate to not even really approaching or working with communities or peoples just to see where collaborations could occur. One REB said, how do they design the application and the REB processes so that they have frequent consultation while also ensuring that they're not overburdening communities? And as well, some board members spoke about how sometimes those who want to do Indigenous research are kind of quote unquote scared off by what they're told from their supervisors are potentially, quote unquote extra work. So for example, things like relationship building, it takes the amount of time that it takes. And, from my experience, it can't be pushed. And this is something that, maybe some non-Indigenous researchers don't understand or want to do. And perhaps some board members may not fully understand either. And just with things with funding as well is an issue. So to me, this kind of connects to the need for researchers to, really have that guidance and encouragement to position themselves within their research to, evaluate who they are and where they come from and, why they're seeking to do this work. And I think it's important that they're encouraged to critically evaluate why they want to do certain work with certain folks and, what's their personal connection to it. Do they feel that they're the best person to do this work and whose lands are they working upon as well? And I do see REBs needing to provide this type of support and guidance to all of those involved in the research process. And again, so kind of making that ethical review process is kind of like this holistic whole that's more like a teaching tool. And so one specific thing one REB spoke of was really how resources need to be shared with communities, how there's a need to stand up to kind of that institutional oppressive sort of limiting structures and need to really work to enable communities to be able to do their own ethical review processes. But in a lot of cases, you know, REBs understandably don't know where to begin with that. And ultimately, from this work, it is clear that ethical review processes, you know, really have to center those meaningful and genuine relationships, you know, with all the communities whose lands your institution is upon, as well as all those involved within the research itself. So in that kind of holistic, you know, centered way. So ultimately, you know, these are some of them. I obviously running out of time a little bit. So there are other details and future considerations within the final report that I didn't fully discuss here, but I hope this does give a little bit of a snapshot of the knowledge that I've gathered so far during this work. And thank you so much for listening.
Clecco, Michelle, Tara, and Sarah. So many questions and so many thoughts that keep popping up in my mind, and thinking about the who, what, when, why, and how that Michelle spoke about. Thinking about how do we understand who has the authority to speak from community, and how does the institution know who that right person is as well. And then thinking about your framework, and I'm grateful for the framework. I had to smile when I saw the trees come up and the roots, and thinking about even how the roots feed each other. But if they don't have that, then how do they thrive? And so just really appreciating, and my presentation actually kind of wraps this all up, and then I'm going to read the comments and questions that we have. But one of the other things thinking about cultural safety is an assessment on cultural safety. How well do we do when we take cultural safety tools using, and I saw some of the comments, the Sinai's cultural safety programs, or post-secondary institutions and other organizations have cultural safety training that you can sign up for and take. And so University of Victoria, Paul Fitanui had, with a team and with collaboration with other post-secondary, had created an assessment tool for cultural safety. And I'll get to that in a second. But, and folks listening, thank you for listening and being with us today. And I, again, just encourage putting your comments and questions in the chat box, because I'm looking forward to hearing more about that. Having dialogue. I'm going to give you time for dialogue. I won't take up too much time for everybody, but Indigenous Research Ethics. I've been a Royal Roads University family member since 2013. I've been here for 9 years. From 2013 to 2019, I was the sole Indigenous employee for Royal Roads University. So anything that had to do with Indigenous. And Sarah and Tara, when you talk about the, you know, that burnout, that always go-to person, that has been me for Royal Roads University, and almost continues since 2019. We have our Indigenous Education Manager, Russell Johnston, who works with faculty now. And then we have our Indigenous Student Services Coordinator, Candace Cook, who works with all Indigenous students. And then, but Indigenous Research Ethics has been one of those milestones, one of those pieces of skills that I enjoy doing, and I enjoy reading, reviewing Indigenous research ethics applications from researchers. And researchers can be students or they can be faculty. I still am the sole one that goes through this. So when Sarah and Tara, you talk about moving that forward, what improvements have been made and changes that have made from a simple checkbox on the research application, research ethics form. Are you doing Aboriginal research? From 2013, there was just a little checkbox. Yes, but there was no anything underneath that. And so when I arrived, they assigned me to sit on the research ethics board. And when the very first meeting, and I said that we have to do better. We can do better with knowledge sharing, with understanding, and bringing other folks in. Dr. Leslie Brown, who's from University of Victoria. Leslie, dear friend of mine, her and I sat down in 2014 to 2016 discussing how can we improve Indigenous research ethics. So one of my thing was that we need our own Indigenous Research Ethics board. I said, because, and it's not an added piece or more work, it's just a separate from Western research ethics. Of course, just talking with many scholars, many friends across Turtle Island, and just getting some feedback saying that's not possible at this time. It's still on my to-do list, on my thing to say. Again, I've always come back, why? How come? We can do this. So changing systems thinking and structures within the academic institution. So Dr. Leslie Brown and I, when she came in, we said we need a guiding principle for Indigenous research ethics, and I will go over that in a second. But we wanted to back up and really acknowledge the last 70 years of 7 generations of Indigenous research. And when we were creating this, I said it's time to start training research ethics board members, because I cannot be the sole Indigenous research ethics reviewer for the university. Currently, I still am. Due to the pandemic, going back to school, the pandemic and things, the training was on pause. I plan on revising that training for our faculty and associate faculty coming up in September, doing some training modules. And what we do is we take them through a journey in thinking about, let's think about the history of research. We think about the first generation, second generation, third, and fourth. I work quite a bit in metaphors. That's just how I can get folks to really understand and unpack what does Indigenous knowledge mean. And I want to use the sequoia tree because the tree was mentioned in the previous. For sequoia tree, for example, we're renaming all of our buildings on campus to trees, most of our buildings to trees. And we want to always put it back out to communities and start speaking with the last fluent Lekwungen speaker, Elder Elmer George, as well as his hereditary Chief Edward Thomas, who's been learning the Lekwungen language as much as possible. We sat down and talked about what does it mean to bring Lekwungen language to campus, but also then translating names into tree names. So we listed, of course, the cedar tree, or not the cedar tree because we have a cedar building. We listed a maple tree. We listed a birch tree and a couple others. But the one tree I put on there was the sequoia tree. And I put the sequoia tree on there, and hereditary Chief Edward Thomas said, but it's not organically from these lands. And I said, I know. And he said, I said, it comes from down south. I said, let me just explain. It comes from down south, comes down from California lands, and somebody had brought a sequoia tree up to these lands, planted it. A sequoia tree cannot thrive unless it's feeding off the other native plants that surround it. So the roots dig in, but it can only thrive as long as it's borrowing from the roots from underneath, the organic roots from underneath. And that's how it thrives, and that's how it stays alive and continues to grow. That's that metaphor of Indigenous ways of knowing and being have always been there. They're always there. And when you take and you have somebody come in, or another person who wants to grow and understand how they can thrive with that knowledge and share that knowledge and utilize that knowledge that feeds them only. And so the sequoia roots are going to take more than they need. They're only going to take what they need to be able to thrive. And that there, and I was telling hereditary Chief Edward Thomas, I said, that there is the metaphor for post-secondary institutions here at within Lekwungen and Kasasa lands for rural roads. And of course, we put the notice out, we put the trees and the meanings, not all of the meanings, but the tree names out as a community vote, and the sequoia tree won. So our Learning Innovation Center became the sequoia tree. Understanding that for our faculty and our associate faculty, our executive and our board, to say that in order to thrive in thinking about what is truth and reconciliation, what is this decolonization, what is this idea that we're wanting to work into this indigenization space, how can we continue to move forward? Well, we have to go back and talk about truth. We have to go back and talk about what's the truth of researchers. Well, they didn't respect Indigenous ways of knowing and being. Appropriation, customs, knowledge, folklore was the prominent idea of what or who are Indigenous people. And then moving forward into into, okay, working on where you talk about reservations, the reserve systems, do they understand the governing structures, and where do they all start and where do they begin? And then, of course, assimilation, when we talk about residential schools, a key component of the history of Indigenous people's lives within what we call the boundaries of Canada. And then we moving on to the resistance and rebellion stages. And as we did this, we put all of these stages around a room when I was training the faculty and associate faculty. I said, it's really understanding how much do you know, or where did your story begin when you were thinking about Indigenous people? And we had asked them, go stand into any of these 7 generations places. And then where is it that we all want to go? So they would start, some started in the 2nd and 3rd generation, some started in the 5th generation based on potentially their age, potentially of their own history of working with Indigenous people. And then we wanted to say, okay, for the 7th generation, responsible research and innovation, acknowledgement of traditional ways of knowing and being, that is one of our starting goals. This doesn't end here at the 7th generation. It's not that checkbox. So we're going to move forward within the Royal Roads University family. And so what is it that we need to do? If they started off the 3rd generation, then we knew we had I knew that we had a lot more training that we had to do. They needed more training than somebody who was standing at the 6th generation. The process of that is even that metaphor of paddling together, getting a canoe and paddling together. And Melanie Mark uses that paddling, hashtag paddle together. And I wanted to understand how many people understood how to hold a paddle, how many knew how to put a life jacket on, how many people knew what position in the canoe, if they sat in the front or if they were the skipper in the back. And did they know that the one in the front is actually leading the pace of the paddlers, and the one in the back, the skipper, is leading the direction, and then all the other paddlers are really listening and learning. I wanted to know and curious about who's still standing on shore because they don't feel comfortable holding a paddle and they don't feel comfortable putting on a life preserver. And so continuing to move forward, of course, bringing up the Tri-Council Chapter 9 highlights, and then thinking about, again, what are the transitions and transformations that have happened in research, and where are we still at? If we have our faculty and our associate faculty who are standing at Generation 3 stage as an example, and based on all of that. And then we do have, and I'm not going to lie, we do have some Indigenous, or sorry, not Indigenous folks, some folks who don't understand Indigenous research ethics. They don't understand and they don't want to know. And my response back to them is I said, that's okay. You continue to go over and do your work with other research ethics applications. And we still have a long ways to go because sometimes they get into the mindset where they also encourage students not to do Indigenous research. They said, oh no, you don't want to do that. That's too much work. No, there's not enough resources for that. No, we don't understand that. This isn't an Indigenous university. And so they call me up and then they say, well, I was just told I wasn't allowed. And I said, well, why not? You're the researcher, you're the student. This is your journey. It's not just ours. We're here to just support you and moving along the way. So currently right now, students will write their research proposal. They'll start their research ethics application, and that's when they contact me. And this is the flaw in the system. Indigenous research, as you can see down in this area, they say, have you connected with the Indigenous Education Department, which is myself, and just to go over to ensure that they have the added support. This is from the Tri-Council Chapter 9 application. So we took this, I had a look at this, and I said, we can do better at Royal Roads University. And that's when I said, here's the 6 principles that we need to add to train researchers, whether they're students or faculty. Leaving participants better off, and our panelists have talked about that. We want participants better off, and that's also in communities, leaving communities better off. We want them to be part of the research, not the research subject. We want them to be inclusive and add their voice in the research. And again, this gets complicated because and every research ethics application becomes very complex really quickly because of those added information that our panelist is talking about. Who can speak or has authority within the community? Are you speaking to the right folks? What Indigenous knowledge can you data can you gather? How are you going to distinguish between some of that knowledge that you're listening to, and what permission do you have to utilize that information in your research? Of course, it's very complicated. Indigenous control and respect, and that's that Indigenous intellectual property is also a part of that. Indigenous ways of knowing and being is part of that. How can you distinguish between that? And those pronouns of ours and mine have every right to be in there when it comes to Indigenous ways of thinking and being. It becomes, because those have deeper connections to family stories, to family knowledge, to family culture, language, traditions, all in there. And community engagement as well. So Michelle had talked about, okay, if you were, it gets other complicated if you're bringing in band councils into your research, or informing band councils that you're doing your research. And then talking about, again, who has that authority. So again, there's conflict in communities. There can be conflicts in communities. And so understanding, how do you ask the right questions, and how do you ensure that everyone is on the same page and everyone feels safe on the same page? Because the researcher, as you're going in there to talk about to participants, are they representing their culture or their nation? Are they representing their family? And also, do they have permission from each of those? One of the things that we didn't see in the Tri-Council was Indigenous lands and artifacts that weren't in there. How is researchers utilizing and having connections to that? And what is that relationship bound? So after we went through all of that, we looked at the research involving Indigenous peoples, and this is where we added, please confirm that you have consulted with RE's Director of Indigenous Engagement, because enough over time, this is trial and error. This comes into, okay, so we improved from the checkbox, we improved the amount of information we need to get, we understand it, and then we have this whole section in there. They will start writing some researchers will get this, they will research, put in the research ethics application to the research ethics board. The research ethics board will notice that they didn't engage with me first, and so it'll delay their research ethics application, and then they will have to set up an appointment with me to go over that. To go over the research ethics. And some of it is that engaging and to smooth things out that are very complex in Indigenous research, especially when you're working with Indigenous peoples, Indigenous organizations, Indigenous companies, Indigenous land, Indigenous nations. All of those are very different. Indigenous band councils, so come very different. And then I will work with them to ensure that they feel supported. And this is the three messages I say. Researchers, I'm here to support you, to ensure that you are protected and you're from the university, because not all faculty and assistant faculty understand, or academic supervisors understand Indigenous research ethics. They just feel supported, and they have that added support. Two is to protect the reputation of Royal Roads University. And then the third, and the most, I feel the most important, is to protect whoever their research subjects are, communities, Indigenous people, Indigenous organization, that they understand, when a researcher goes into your community or into your organization and starts working with you, I'm hoping they continue a relationship that's lifelong. And so making that connection and ensuring that the research stays with them, and they understand the process every step of the way. So they're not just a checkbox on the research ethics application, that they know they can call me if there's a discrepancy, if there's miscommunication, they're not understanding something. And I have had that where students will fill out their ethics application, everything looks good. They will go into community and they're doing absolutely the opposite of what they said. And so that when the community calls me, then we have a meeting with the student. I have a meeting with the student, the supervisor, our university. And then there's only been one incident in the 9 years I've been here where I've pulled the student out of that research project and went and did protocols and apologized back to the communities. So here's the research approval process that has been in place improving new pathways. We are now going to implement where research proposals, when researchers are writing their research proposals, I have to be involved at the very beginning to talk about those Indigenous ways of thinking and being, Indigenous methodologies, Indigenous research. So I will be one step, I guess, back, I'm going to say, with researchers to ensure that they're doing things in the right way. Now, the other improvement that I've said to the university is to think about updates and next steps. I only have one more slide, I believe, after this, as to engage with honoring Indigenous leaders. So in order to be an research supervisor for researchers, is that you ideally typically have a PhD, you have a higher education, you have that piece of a document. And currently what we have now is an application where the student can send in and say, I know an Indigenous leader who has been working within communities, let's say health, for a number of years, and here's their experience, and I believe they would be a great supervisor for my research. And then what we do is we pair them up with myself as well as another, a member from the Research Ethics Board. And that's to support the supervisor without overburdening them, without giving them, you know, such a big task that they're not doing it alone, that we're working together. So they can do that now, where they don't need those academic letters behind their name, that we're honoring that Indigenous ways of knowing and being isn't just with our Indigenous scholars who have taken that education journey in a Western way, that we are honoring the traditional ways of knowing and being. Currently, we have one student who submitted this application for her doctoral degree, and we do have an Indigenous leader within their community who is supporting the student as their supervisor to ensure they're conducting their research in a respectful way, helping and assisting and guiding in their research process. It's similar to the faculty members and how they're advised, and supervisors, how they're advised as well. That is my presentation, just kind of wrapping everything up together. I'm going to stop sharing. Can we do this? Thank you for listening to me. Clecco, Clecco. I would like to now open up for comments and questions with everybody. Maybe even starting with our panelists to ask if they have any comments or questions for each other or for others. And I'm going to scroll through the chat box to see if we can find any comments and questions as well. Tara, any follow? Oh, you're on mute.
I have to check out shortly and catch my airplane home, but I was noticing some of the questions in the chat box, so I'd like to share a few things. Thank you, every fellow panelist. It was great to listen to each of you and learn more about what you do. So a question came up about open access and OCAP and data sovereignty. So I just had a conversation yesterday with the Métis community here in Saskatchewan, some scholars, and they brought up some really good points for me that really made me think, and the difference, and they were talking about to think more critically about the difference between OCAP and data sovereignty in general. So like OCAP itself was very purposeful in what it was for and why it was created. So it's First Nations based and was really intended to around big data, like big data. And so the Métis community was having a panel discussion actually yesterday about how they're creating their own, that it does, like they're creating their own, it won't be OCAP, but their own research principles that will resonate with their community more. So they just kind of really emphasized, yeah, to think of the difference of OCAP and then doing research in a good way. So, and actually just what that means and what data sovereignty means. And when you're thinking about open access, so probably the main thing over OCAP is what is the community, so what have MOUs or governance agreements been in place. And it's really clearly laid out where how the data is used, what's the purpose, how is it stored, how is it shared. And so open access wouldn't be a problem if the community fully knows and agrees, right? It's their data. So it's, if they agree that open access and this, what it means if a year from now, we could remove it from the website or whatever, but somebody may still have access to it and share it. So that's where those MOUs and governance agreements before we start our research really play an important role and can help conduct the research in a good way from start and finish and future. I'd also like to share with you that somebody asked about community-based ethics and frameworks. So one of our facilitators, so the BC NEIHR is trying to support this. We are hoping to start a funding call for communities that are ready to develop their own ethics and research framework. So obviously that would be the very first thing that would really kind of govern your research and how you're conducting it if the community has it. And one of our facilitators, we have 5 research facilitators that work directly with ICCOs. They're in service to ICCOs in whatever way is wanted. I asked her to do like an environmental scan of BC and like try and find any of those that are available. So I'm going to share with you what she created, and we put it on a map. It's pretty cool. Just give me one moment. And this will be shared on our website. I've been very busy with travel lately. So we can see, I think there's like 13 that she found. And for example, when you click on it, this is the community, and then you can go to the link of their framework. This is Asketum, Panina Sarah Lynn Harding. She's a PhD candidate from Asketum. She's at UMBC, created this. And this policy is, I'm trying to scroll just a second, is incredibly comprehensive. It is so detailed. And it goes into like different types, well, it talks about the community, the governance of the community, tangible knowledge. Okay, so as you can see, hopefully the whole process, if you want to do research with the Asketum community, this is the process, this is the governance. And then I just want to show you the one screen. I will stop in a second when I get to it and let you see it. So this, like, for example, the tangible and intangible property, and this is in knowledges, right? And really, like, this breaks it down, this framework. It's so detailed. So once that goes up online, again, I encourage you to look at these, and then we're hoping we can keep adding to this, right? Hoping to have a funding call, like I said, for communities. Panina is also with the BC NEIHR. Will be developing for communities like a resource, video-based, thinking TikTok, because she's actually a TikTok star. She's like famous on TikTok, but breaking it down by 2-3 minute videos of how their community created that. What were the key considerations? What was the process behind the process, and having that as a resource for other ICCOs, having that resource, and then on top of the funding to be able to do it. And then hopefully more and more we can add to this map. And like I said, that will be shared shortly on our website.
That is amazing. Oh my gosh, that makes me so happy knowing that nations are stepping forward and saying, we want that for our community, and it protects their community and their members and their information. I know back in Newtownth, Leslie and I traveled down to Newtownth and did that overview of research ethics. What does it mean? And trying to get out to this now after the pandemic and wanting to do that. So that might be a great partnership. Other comments, questions? Review here. Thank you to the presenters for such rich sharing from Ron. Grateful for that. There's a talk at TRU about Indigenous Research Ethics Board on the TRU .ca/indigenous education team who have a event that's coming up. I'm looking forward to that. I will sign up for that as well. Others? Does anybody else who's online? There are 118 participants, and Tara, I know you have to head out soon. I'm so grateful that you were able to join and sharing your knowledge and resources. I appreciate your time and energy, and just grateful to sit in circle with you this morning. And when you have to go, I wish you safe travels. Anybody else who wants to ask a question but not put in the question or in the chat box, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask a question or have a comment. A quiet audience today, wanting to have dialogue, and not many folks want to have dialogue today. I guess they've enjoyed listening, which is great.
Well, maybe I can just share, building on the work that Tara and Sarah are doing. I have a team that we're looking at the experiences of Indigenous researchers navigating, bringing their own frame of ethics into the academy and looking at that intersection between that and an REB. And so this is an international study where we're looking at across Canada, but also in Aotearoa. And so far we've looked at the policies. We're doing interviews as well, but in the policies we have roughly about 57 institutions, public universities, French and English, looking at how they've talked about Indigenous ethics and research. And the majority of folks are using TCPS2 as their framework and guide, and that's the baseline. But we've also noticed that within that group, let me just make sure I get my numbers right, because if I don't, my team will tell me. There's about 13 institutions that are doing TCPS2+, which means they're going beyond. Within TCPS Chapter 9, there are certain things that are recommended. And these institutions, these 13 institutions, are actually doing it required. So they're requiring an Indigenous board member, they're requiring training, they're requiring various elements. So taking those recommendations into requirements. 6 are looking at specifically Indigenous ethics, and they have their own ethics board, or are working with Indigenous communities in a very particular way. And 6 specifically mention OCAP. Right? And Tara's right, like OCAP is a First Nations perspective. It doesn't include all nations, and thinking about those places and complexities. And I think also looking at across the country that there are going to be provincial influences on the work. And so what BC is doing is going to be different, say, than in Newfoundland. And I think that's also important as we think about that. And within Aotearoa, really their work and their ethics is guided by the Treaty of Waitangi. And within that, there are 8 institutions that follow that treaty as their ethics guideline, which really speaks to Kapapa Maori and all the ways of Maori Indigenous knowledges and research ethics. And thinking there are 4 that do the Treaty Plus. So they're doing something also additional to the treaty. And so thinking about those pieces. So I think the connection between policy and practice is critically important, because if it's not in policy, the ways that we get interpreted, misinterpreted, misrepresented are really important. And so the policies become the place from which we can then leverage change. And then it's sustained change, right? And thinking about how we make those, going from system changes and Asma-na-hi not being the only person at our institution, but creating these institutional changes so that at some point she will move on to other things in life, and then that legacy is left behind and the institution really benefits from it. So, I mean, I think it's important we raise our hands to all those who are in that work, really making those sustained changes, because I think it is a lot of work that goes unseen. And so I just want to take a moment to see all of you who are doing that work and recognizing it. So anyway, just share that since we had a little time.
Thank you for those words, because that's important. Where I think about the treaty, what does treaty mean, and recognizing it, and then also not grouping us into this pan Indigenous research ethics approach either, right? Because we are very different from the East Coast to the West Coast. Every family has their own way of thinking and being, and practices and traditions. I see a hand up. Rob?
Yeah, Asma-na-hi, thanks very much for pointing me out. Michelle, that was really interesting what you were saying there about an international context for how we think about Indigenous research. And I think to a certain extent, we have a set of common touch points, if you like, in South American countries and in Australia, New Zealand, where the discussions around Indigenous rights are very pronounced, and the ethical questions have been well articulated there. I was wondering to an extent how you might think we could proceed in terms of thinking of a more of an intra-national conversation that the research ethics boards could be involved in, which might include countries like Sweden, India, and other types of other locations of Indigenous cultures which have different types of political questions surrounding them, and how the REBs as a particular kind of institutional organization might be able to engage with them and prompt those discussions to happen.
I think you answered your question. I think you bring people together, right? And I think to me, the leads should be the Indigenous groups and organizations who have been leading this work. Let them decide the conversation that needs to happen, and then the REBs witness what's being shared by community, by those Indigenous leaders. And so I think at an international space, there are international conferences where we gather as Indigenous peoples, and that might be a place to witness some of that work and those conversations. So I think about the World Indigenous Peoples Conference, for example. And that particular conference isn't necessarily held, or it's a community organization. It's a community led. So we go there as Indigenous peoples, not necessarily with our formal, professional titles. So it's not an academic conference to think about it in that way, which I think is really important also to witness, to see how we gather. So whether there's, I think the international and conversations, intertribal conversations on a global scale really need to be considered within the nuanced locations of those peoples and the histories of each country. Captain Cook is well known amongst many of our lands. And so there are some things that tie us together, such as colonialism. But I also think how, say, the Aboriginal folks in Australia, or the Maori in New Zealand, or the Sami in Lapland think about these things are really grounded in their own political and geographical context and histories. And so how do we have these nuanced conversations without creating a pan-Indigenous view? Because that's where we get lost. That's where the nuances of how the Métis, how urban Indigenous folks who may not necessarily be tied to community, how folks who are, survivors of the 60s scoop might be coming into this work, so there's lots of complex nuances, I think, for us to be talking from.
That's great. Thanks very much, Michelle.
Great. I think all of these questions can really be a theme for another conference sometimes. The nuances, and when you talk about Métis First Nations in a 60 scoop residential school, like there's these multiple layers that happen within research that if you don't understand them all or know them all, then it creates that complexity to which takes away, I think, from the research rather than from the researcher and the research and the communities, because we're training others to understand why and how we do the research in a very different way. And Indigenous is colonial perspective, not our peoples and nations. Absolutely. Absolutely. Other comments, other questions? Ugh, time to have dialogue. Sarah, do you have any comments? And maybe we'll have closing comments after.
I don't really have any comments. I'm a bit of a learner here. So I, you know, and I am very humble and grateful to be in that position. You know, I do see a lot of commonalities just in terms of, you know, some things that those that I spoke with within this work, and things that I kind of conclusions I sort of came to just by looking at applications and things like that, really echoing a little bit about, you know, what Michelle and Asma-na-hi and, you know, Tara have all shared, as well as, you know, the questions and comments from everybody who has shared something so far. And yeah, so I mean, I don't really have anything else. The only thing is just that, you know, ultimately, like with this work, I know that there will be kind of that final summary report that is really meant to be shared with all the REB members. So hopefully that will be, you know, of help to everybody. But other than that, I'm just learning. So thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Kenna, my apologies for mispronouncing your name. REBs may worry that they are over reviewing Indigenous-led research, especially research within their own communities, and may not be asking enough questions of non-Indigenous-led research, especially with respect to sharing and disseminating community knowledge. Are there approaches to help with this? Michelle or Sarah, do you have any comments with this question? Are there approaches to help with this?
I'm just going to take a second just to reread the question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. And I think one of the things that, you know, I think we need to consider is where's the burden being placed? Is it being placed on the individual researcher? And again, I think it goes back to who the researcher is. So take a pause to say, who is this researcher? Are they beginning like Sarah and new to the REB process? Are they a graduate student? If they're a graduate student, who are they being supervised by? Who are they being mentored by into that work? And then take a pause to say, okay, is this the place where we think through how they've articulated the relationship with community, how they've articulated the process, have they articulated? And I would say these questions maybe go to all folks, but I think the who is doing the work matters, and the positionality, because, you know, Sarah coming in new as a graduate student, you only have 3 years to get your master's done, right? Like there's a time crunch. And I think, you know, in my work with students, I often say you have to have an established relationship. If you're coming in as an Indigenous scholar, coming into this work, and you want to do work within your community or a local community or an organization, do you have those established relationships? Because that is the work. The question and the project will come, but it comes from that relationship. So if that isn't in place, I often say then, okay, well, let's rethink what we're doing, because the relationships matter first and foremost. And in the context of an academic setting, those questions need to be asked to make sure. And then I think the pieces that I see happening is that because REBs don't necessarily have folks on the committees and or don't necessarily have the understanding, they are going in depth into Indigenous focused work. If it's a non-Indigenous researcher, again, do they have those established relationships? Are they asking those right questions? Are you looking for those things? I think community agreements are really important in terms of the communities defining how they want to see that information housed, held, who owns it, reciprocity agreements, all those pieces. I think it's really important that the communities have a say in that. And if they don't, then ask them, would you like to have a say? How would you like this? And maybe this is where ethic boards can help with having a I hate to say it like a common form, but some kind of way of verifying with communities that they're okay. And it's not to be condescending or putting more work on communities, right? So there's a balance between what are we trying to do in this work? Are we trying to uphold and lift Indigenous processes, or are we trying to minimize litigation or minimize risk from an institutional perspective. I think we should be minimizing risk to both the researcher and the communities. And thinking about what that, and not necessarily risk, but what are our responsibilities to that work. So I don't know if that really answers the question, but I think there's a lot to tease out in that.
Thank you, Michelle. I agree. There's a lot to figure out, and it's that communication. How on board is everyone? And I do have a story I want to share, but before I do, Namaste. I see your hand up. Hi, nice to see you.
Oh, that was lovely. Thank you so much. I really want to see that happen at every institution, including UBC, where I currently am. I think I just wanted to add to Michelle's comments. I think like I go a step back, a step farther, and I think universities need to get to a place where they're understanding what UNDRIP means, they're understanding what those relationships need to look like at not just a community, but like a nation level, and start appreciating jurisdiction a little bit more fully. And if we had those institutional relationships more formalized and more clear, we would actually see our priorities reflected in the research agenda. We're still seeing this kind of gold rush mentality with researchers running out to get money and partnering with communities. We need something much farther back, much more upstream, where we're setting our own research priorities and we're telling the universities what we want to see work done in and how we want and who we want to do that work. So it is a larger systemic issue, and I find things, all these like very challenging issues get bottlenecked at the REB stage, and we really need competent Indigenous review in BC. There's no way around that. So just wanted to add that.
Thank you so much for adding that. I wanted to, I'll add on to that as well. And it does get that bottleneck, but it also is that very open, wide mouth. I'm going to use the wide mouth jar. Me and my metaphors, wide mouth jar, where the universe or the academic institutions trust researchers to say, oh yeah, no, I've got a working relationship with a nation or with my own nation. I'm going to use an example, and one of the reasons of this idea why we need to improve Indigenous research ethics. So one of the community elders had approached and said they had a researcher who wanted to go back to their community to receive Indigenous traditional name, and wanted to learn about that cultural protocol and the cultural process to get to the ceremony. It was a year planning. The researcher went into community, talked to elders, talked to the community, learned about all of these traditional practices, then without saying they were a researcher. And then when the time came to hold the naming ceremony, went through the practice. And of course, the house is full. And then at the end of the naming ceremony process, the academic institution research committee stood up and asked some more questions. And then all of a sudden the community was like, wait a minute, what's happening here? And it turned out it was her defense, their defense. And then all of a sudden it was just this whole interruption within the community, within the family. And it was part of that, the complexity of a researcher going in wanting to learn about this, but without communicating back. The academic institution had no idea what was happening, but trusting the researcher to go in. And this is where I think that idea of research ethics boards and faculty and associate faculty in that training aspect is so important, is that are we asking the researcher, and how are we holding them accountable back to the community? But also for me, it's making sure the community knows what's happening. And so that constant communication, checking in, having opportunities to say, how are you doing? How are you finding it? How's the relationship? Is there anything I can help and assist with? Are we all on the same page? Because mishaps can happen. And if they're not easily communicated and thus connecting those dots aren't easily seen, the transparency in that isn't seen, it causes not only just, I don't want to think about like the responsibility back to the institution, but it is part of that institution responsibility and holding accountable, but the researcher holding them accountable. And also, we leaving the community better off and their families better off. And that really comes down to that priority as well. I am thinking, so I'm trying to navigate the chat box and everything here. Thank you for adding a link here, research practices transformed by Indigenous policy paper. Ron, I appreciate that. Justin says, thinking of Marlene when she shared the Nakota elder who said it's important we start researching ourselves to life in this regard. How can local, regional, provincial REBs be of service to this ancestral dignity, thriving and flourishing, Indigenous laws, etc. I want to thank you for this very important work of our common humanity. And thank you for putting the X in the word humanity in there as well. Thank you for that, Justin. That's a beautiful comment. A question has come through. How have maybe for myself and Michelle, have we handled proposals for research for students primarily who overreach and have not looked for financial resources that they need? Do you think REBs have a role in directing researchers to access resources that may have been intimidated to find that the institution has not made available? Lately, I've been thinking REBs need to be proactive in making connections to improve access to institutional resources. Absolutely. Michelle, I will go first. I'm really happy to say that we have a grant available for Indigenous students who want to go back to their home communities, whether they've been back home into their home communities or not. They want to go and do research with their communities, of course, following research ethics first, that they can apply for resources up to $5,000 that supports their research. That's just new this year. It doesn't have to be tied to research though. If an Indigenous student, for example, the 60 Scoobor residential school, the intergenerational impacts that we know of, I'm going to use myself. If I was a student at Royal Roads University and I was like, you know what, I have never been home and, you know, financially I can't do that, but I want to bring me and my 2 children back to Toquot lands, and I could fill out this application, send it into Royal Roads, it would get approved, and then they would fund my time to go home. It doesn't have to be tied to school. It is an opportunity. We've had a few students receive that funding and then go back to the communities, whether it's for research or on their own. But the latest one was a member of the 60 Scoop who wants to go back. I've never been back to their traditional lands with their family. And then what is the uptake of that is that they don't have to send us, like, they don't have to prove that they've sent that, you know, what that impact was. They're welcome to share their stories if they want, but they don't have to. So that's just, you know, how can we improve where it's not really tied to education journey, but to the personal journey themselves. Michelle, do you have a comment on this? It was a personal question.
I guess I think about the responsibility and scope of an REB and where the connections are for the REB to the other supports within their institution. And so where those relationships that could help maybe connect research funding and REBs, but I think that also is it's a little bit murky for me in terms of how we support researchers doing that work. And I think for students, it's about ensuring that they have the right the mentorship and support to navigate those things, and having access to grants even before applying to an REB, I think would be important because they need to know they can afford to do the work, whether that's, you know, traveling or providing cultural honoraria and gifts. And so how are they thinking about that? And so I think at the point of application to REB, they should have already thought about that. And if they haven't, then maybe the REB can be like, hey, how, what financial supports are you using to do this? And I don't know, like that might be a bit of a personal thing. Like some students may be in the place to afford to say, I can blanket and I can honor my participants my way and my cultural protocols. It's my responsibility. And others might say, no, I need financial help, and how can we do that? So, and then thinking about what are the institutional, because I know different institutions have different institutional requirements for accessing funds. How do we help lower some of those barriers? I know from the work that we've done, one of my students did years ago, how we even label or name Indigenous awards or bursaries or grants can impact how students might choose to apply for them or not, right? So if an award is called leadership, a lot of our students wouldn't apply for it because it's not culturally appropriate for them to say they're leaders. But if it's a community engagement award, it can be changed, right? And so I think even institutionally, we have to think about how we are providing opportunities and how are we communicating to our students the kinds of opportunities that are available for them to apply for, and then what are the barriers we're putting in the way for students to successfully thrive in our institutions.
A very good point. Are we supporting versus burdening or adding additional stress to researchers, to students as well? And that when I think about those barriers and those mishaps, how can we continue to improve? How can we do better within an academic institution? Any other comments or questions?
Sorry, I just wanted to add, I just didn't want to interrupt or anything.
No,
yeah.
Let's have any
No,
conversations.
yeah, for sure. And I mean, I really echo like all of those things that you said. I just, from my perspective, really just beginning this process, I knew that I needed, a certain amount of money to be able to do this work in a good way, or else I wasn't going to do it, like, period. That's just what I needed. And so I did, I think I probably ended up having to, do a lot of grant writing and things like that, did a lot of proposals. And in each proposal, I did write into, my own need to be able to go back to my home territories. And that's what I was talking about in the beginning, because, that kind of reconnection to family and medicine gathering, like out on the land, is really part of like the research methodology that I'm planning to kind of do. So even though that's not actually like, that's not where I will be doing the research or anything like that, like that it's really interconnected, because it really informs my way of approaching. And even just like that initial approach before even really doing anything, having like my own spirit ready, having my own self ready, and that reconnection. So I wrote those into my proposals. And I really needed, like, I really thought I wanted to have quite a bit of money, because I want to pay people like a living wage, honestly, to be able to do, like, to be participating. And it is difficult, right? Like it's hard. And then also, just like, I haven't finished the ethics application. I have gotten funding, but, things do take a long time, like, especially like I'm working with, folks who are experiencing houselessness and like substance use issues. And like, it does take a long time, even just kind of connecting back and forth, so in a way, it's a little bit like, I know this funding is coming and it kind of has to be used within like a certain time frame, but it's not necessarily matching with how things are going in terms of my community relationships and things like that. So I just wanted to add those pieces.
Thank you, Sarah. Values and beliefs, that emotional connection as Indigenous researchers that we have, that following our own family protocols and how we engage with what we call family community participants in research, we have a different value and belief of that, and a different protocol that we are responsible. Well, I'm going to use that. I am responsible for, I need to be accountable to, I need to ensure that I am not just representing the protocols that I follow come from the protocols I learned from family, the protocols I learned from community. And we talk. And this is that idea of we talk and we learn from each other and we hear from each other. And then if I'm not following them, they will say something. If I'm not doing things accordingly, the elders and the old ones within this community even will say something. Asma-na-hi. And I will sit there and I will say, oh, what happened? What did I do? And I will hold myself accountable to that. But that I've learned my lesson to be able to hold myself accountable always in that carrying those values and beliefs. So thank you, Sarah, for sharing that. Any other thoughts or comments? We have about another 10 minutes. If not, then time is a gift, right? Time is a gift. I know that, right?
I haven't seen anything else pop up, so I just want to say thank you so much. This has been a wonderful session, so informative, lots of sharing that we really, really appreciate. I know that we're all looking forward to hearing more about how research ethics boards and how the results from your report, Sarah. How what else can we do for research ethics boards, and how can Research Ethics BC and some of our some of the partner organizations we work with help to lift that and help researchers to do the good work. And so really looking forward to that. And I just want to say thank you very much. And I also want to say thank you to our organizing committee, because although you saw my face and you probably saw a couple people from my team, Jessica and Rachel, who were both supporting us in the background here. I just want to say thank you to the organizing committee, because we had some great suggestions for speakers and they helped us to make the connections, which is what it's all about sometimes. So I just want to say thank you to Kim Lajoie from Simon Fraser University Research Ethics, Laurel Evans and Maria Valente from UBC Research Ethics, Isabel Hartley from UNBC Research Ethics, Kenna Miskelly, who had that wonderful question, from University of Victoria Research Ethics, Lisa Shearer from UBC Okanagan, and then just my team was here with us today. And I know that we had a little bit of a rough start to begin with, so everybody's hearts have stopped palpitating, and it turned out to be a really good session. So thank you very much. And for those of us that are rejoining us this afternoon, we're going to take a little break now, and we will restart with exactly the same Zoom link at 1 o'clock with our next session. Thank you, everyone.